Hi, my name is Wajdan. I'm from Group 1, and today we'll be talking about secondary succession and ecosystem recovery in Point Pleasant Park 20 years after Hurricane Juan. So, a quick background about Hurricane Juan. It happened in September in 2003 in Atlantic Canada, or let's say Nova Scotia. It wasn't a strong hurricane as it was category 2 hurricane. So we know category 1 is like our most of the time the weakest hurricanes, and then category 5 are the strongest, and hurricane 1 was category 2. However, it maintained a continuous winds of 158 kilometer per hour, with gusts switching up to 185 kilometer per hour. So in our study, we're studying secondary succession in Point Pleasant Park. So now, what is a succession? Succession is a natural process in ecology which happens when ecosystems, let's say plants or animals community, gradually change over time, especially after a disturbance, such as in our case, a hurricane. Now, secondary succession is when the ecosystem could recover after a disturbance, which is unlike primary succession, which happens when the ecosystem is not able to recover after this disturbance. So in our study, we have pioneer species. So these species are species that could grow quickly after a disturbance. They usually are short-lived and they reproduce faster and they tolerate extreme conditions. They usually are a weaker competitive, so they get replaced by stronger or competitive species. So previous studies, such as Broley in 2008, talked in his studies that was called Urban Forest Recovery. He mentioned that red maple and mountain ashes grew well in post-hurricane environments as they were tolerant to these environments. Also, we have a slow recovery species. So these species usually establish longer or take longer to establish. They are dominant. They represent or they say shape the ecosystem once the conditions are stable. So previous studies like Burley 2008 mentioned that oak grew slowly but were dominant in late stages of succession. Also, Berg at at his in his studies that was called 20 years 20 years tree survivorship study showed that sugar maple, which are slow-growing and shade-tolerant trees, replaces pioneer species over time, and they tend to be stronger and more dominant over the fast recovery species. So also we'll be looking at recovery after the hurricane and species turnover. Now, what is a species turnover? Species turnover is the change in species composition in an ecosystem over time, or in, let's say, different locations. It is when species replaces other species. Or in other words, it occurs because some species disappear while new ones arrive, which often happens due to hurricanes, as in our case, or natural succession. We'll also be looking at climax community, which is a stable stage of ecological succession, and it happens when an ecosystem has reached its balance where they no longer, let's say, or they no longer change, or they are balanced for, let's say, a while. And which means that species composition of, let's say, plant growth, animal population have stabilized and won't change significantly unless there is a disturbance. And for our study, we are studying succession in 6 different sites of like the most damaged places in Point Pleasant Park, and that data was collected every year since 2004, excluding the 3 hurricane years and the COVID year. Raw data for our study were density and size, or say density per tree species and size per centimeter of each tree. We'll go more into that with my group members.
2 measurements were taken, the density per tree species per 400 meters square and the tree diameter, centimeters, of each tree at breast height, which is measured 4.5 feet off the ground using measuring tapes and calibrators. The data was collected from 6 20 by 20 meter sites at Point Pleasant Park. The sites were chosen in areas of the highest hurricane impact on the forest structure. The data was collected annually from 2004 to 2020, excluding 2005, 2007, 2016, and 2020 due to hurricanes and COVID-19, by students in Biology 2060 at Dalhousie University. Linear regression analysis was used to analyze the data because it allowed for researchers to compare results from each year and to predict the outcome for future years.
Here is a Shannon Diversity Index showing a diversity increase or an overall positive trend in species diversity in Point Pleasant Park, which could also mean that there is an increase in species evenness and richness. Even though we did not measure the hurricane years, there was still a recovery in species diversity, which could relate to secondary succession after a disturbance, or let's say after Hurricane 1. Many mature trees were destroyed, creating an open space for new species to establish, especially pioneer species, those species that, as I mentioned earlier, first colonizing areas or fast growing, fast reproducing, and so on. We predict that the ecosystem would still go to its climax community or its stable stage even after a strong disaster that happens, such as, let's say, strong hurricane or hurricane of category, let's say, 5. Because, however, we predict that there might be a composition change in dominant species because, after a disaster, some species might be more suitable to a specific environment, and so on. So I also want to add that species turnover do slow down the community climax because species that replace or colonize areas faster tend to increase competition. However, they are not a strong competitor for resources, but they do slow down the growth of climax species or species that are dominant or long-lived species, as I mentioned earlier.
The study of species richness was a means to evaluate succession in Point Pleasant Park, aiming to answer how richness changes after a disaster, such as Hurricane Juan. This question was approached by measuring the density per tree species per 400 meters square, and the size of centimeters of each tree at various sites in Point Pleasant Park. The species richness in Point Pleasant Park has increased over time. See Figure 2. This is expected as there are changes in the park community that are consistent with trends described in successional theory. The trees are increasing in abundance as they establish a rich forest canopy. Turchin, 2016. I can predict that as the forest moves towards its climax community, species richness will slow, as the first community to establish after disturbance is the pioneer species, which are short-lived species that have high dispersal capabilities. Malls and Cahill, 2014. Over time, the composition of the mature community will include species that are persistent and long-lived. Malls and Cahill, 2014. Smaller, less resilient species will die off as the larger species grow and use up large amounts of resources. The species richness in Point Pleasant Park has a p-value that is less than 0.5 and has been labeled as significant. This shows that the increase in species richness since the hurricane has been significant.
To measure changes in Point Pleasant Park's density of red spruce over time, the number of red spruce per 400 meters squared was measured yearly from 2004 to 2024. See Figure 2. In 2004, this was the dominant species, with an average density of 3.3 trees per 400 meters squared. In 2024, density has increased by 167% to 8.8 trees per 400 meters squared per year. On average, the linear rate of red spruce density increase has been 0.3 trees per 400 meters squared per year. See Figure 2. Red maple has since become dominant after Hurricane Juan. Its density, in number per 400 meters squared, was similarly measured yearly. The species was not present in 2004, but its density has increased to 31.6 trees per 400 square meters in 2024. On average, the rate of density increase was 2.6 trees per 400 meters squared per year. See Figure 3. The current dominant species, red maple, has shown a higher rate of density increase than the previously dominant species, red spruce. Red maple is considered the pioneer species, as this fast-growing tree was among the first to colonize the area after the disturbance caused by Hurricane Juan. While red spruce is not increasing in density as quickly as red maple, Keyes, 2019, predicts based on soil types that red spruce is likely to dominate at climax, as it did before Hurricane Juan. We therefore expect red maple's rapid increase in density to slow as the ecosystem moves toward its climax community, which it has not yet reached. The forest would best be classified as being an early to mid-succession. Keyes, 2019, describes an early successional vegetation type in this location as being dominated by red maple, with the mid-successional vegetation type dominated by both red maple and red spruce. Both species are showing increases in density, with the continued presence of red spruce being noted, but at this point in the trajectory toward climax community, red maple dominates. As we monitor this ecosystem throughout its recovery, it is important to keep in mind the spiritual and historic significance of this land, Amdugadi, or the place of spirits, to the Mi'kmaq people. The park is in an urban location, meaning that it is impacted by human visitors and actions such as the removal of debris, planting of new trees, and closure of certain areas when necessary. We must consider our interactions with this forest and avoid actions that could hinder its recovery. Recovery does appear to be progressing. Both species diversity and richness have shown steady increases in the years since Hurricane Juan. This is evidence of succession and the gradual approach toward the climax community. Based on the tree species that currently dominate, we predict that the ecosystem is currently in early to mid-succession. Red maple, a fast-growing, early successional plant, is considered dominant and continues to increase in density, but red spruce, a later successional plant, is also present and continuing to increase. At climax, this will likely be the plant that dominates. And while these later stages are likely still many years away, the forest is showing promising indications of recovery.
Acknowledgements. We would like to take a moment to thank Alison Smith for preparing the Biology 2060 Lab Manual and for providing all of the necessary data and instructions for this assignment. We would also like to thank our peers, whom will be evaluating this presentation, and the Mi'kmaq people whose land we reside on. Thank you.
And here is our references.